Hi, everyone. My name is Gabe Maharjan. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the co-president of the Quebec Drama Federation's Board of Directors. I'm also an interdisciplinary artist based in Montreal, and I work in Quebec and beyond, and I am a Quebec Drama Federation member like you, hopefully. Since 1972, the Quebec Drama Federation has been serving the needs of the English language theatre community in Quebec. With hundreds of members, we are committed to providing advocacy, resources, and educational initiatives that support and strengthen our artistic community. The offices of QDF are located on Tiohtià:ke, the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, which has served as a gathering place for interpersonal exchange and performance for many nations for millennia. Our decision to install an internal Ombuds service for our organization came out of the reality that, in order to prevent harassment in the workplace, there needs to be an avenue for all forms of harassment to be addressed. QDF is not alone in this Ombuds endeavor. Collectively, we represent 7 Quebec-based English language theatre companies and organizations within Region 6 of the Professional Association of Canadian Theatres. We, as a coalition, implemented the top recommendation by both the After Me Too survey and the CHRC's federal initiative, Respectful Workplace in the Arts. This recommendation is to establish an independent body to receive reports, investigate, and adjudicate workplace harassment allegations. After 5 initial meetings as a coalition, we identified Omega Ombuds Services as our ideal independent body and Caroline Lemay as our ombudsperson. Thanks to the generous support from the Conseil des Arts de Montréal, the members of our coalition, which include the Quebec Drama Federation, Playwrights Workshop Montreal, Imago Theatre, Black Theatre Workshop, Youth Theatre, Repercussion Theatre, and Hudson Village Theatre, have been engaging the services of Omega Ombuds as of July 1st, 2021. Now, to introduce our guest tonight, Caroline Lemay is the appointed ombudsperson for the QDF and the other theatre companies named, as well as the National Theatre School. She is trained as a lawyer, and she's also trained in conflict prevention and resolution. She has more than 15 years of experience as an impartial third party in a variety of contexts, both locally and internationally. Throughout those years, Caroline developed an approach of conflict prevention and resolution based on ethics that aim to achieve fairness instead of focusing solely on compliance to rules and procedures. Her main concern is to solve tensions and conflict within a community while protecting the relationships between all parties. In order to do so, she uses the spirit of the policies in place, the values promoted by the organization, together with principles and concepts from the psychology of justice, restorative justice ethics, and a trauma-informed approach, with a sensitivity to the risk factors of mental health in the workplace. In 2016, Caroline founded Omega Ombuds Services to offer this innovative service to small organizations that are seeking to foster a safe and healthy environment in a fair and humane way. So welcome, Caroline. Hi, Caroline. It's so lovely to have you.
Hi, thank you. It's nice to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Before I dive into some of the prepared questions that we have for you, I'm going to invite our viewers at home to pop in any questions that you might have throughout this conversation in the chat. We will have time at the end of this conversation to get into some Q&A from our audience. And we ask that you frame these questions really in a way that focuses on the services of an ombudsperson, on the approach. Caroline is not able to provide specific opinions or advice based on circumstances in your workplace or your company, but we can really talk about what an ombudsperson does and how that all integrates into an organization. So to start off, I'm going to start with the big question: what is an ombudsperson?
Okay, thank you. An ombudsperson, we hear the name more often these days in the last years, but I would start by saying that it's a concept that started in Sweden in the 1800s, and ombuds means mediator in Swedish. And the reason why they came up with this concept or this role is to make sure that the citizens were served properly in a fair and equitable manner by the public administration, because for different reasons there were lots of power abuse, but also of unfairness as well. So they created this role to be able to make a bridge between the citizen and the administration that can be hard to maneuver for someone who's not familiar with it or doesn't necessarily have the language or the knowledge to navigate those things. And so it's a concept that stayed over the years and the centuries, and it's been exported in different administration around the world, always with the idea of assuring that the administrative services are fair to the person they're supposed to serve. So it kind of spread within like bigger organization. Now there's banks, there public administration has administrations that are also private companies who have them. So always with the idea of better serving the public. And what so the role of the ombuds is very much anchored into fairness, and also try to diminish as much as possible the differential of power between the user of the service and the ones who provide them. And generally speaking, an ombuds has 4 different roles. So the first one is to listen to the member they're supposed to serve. I would say the visitors, because this is how, like, the generic word that we use for the purpose, the user of the service. So is to listen to the visitors because they might have concern that they don't know to whom to talk about, and also they want to raise their concern and put language around what they're experiencing. So that's the first aspect. When I started my practice, I thought that this aspect of the Ombuds services will be the less requested, but I realized with time that it is the most requested, because people would like to have an independent party or impartial party to talk to. So it can be used also like as a soundboard, if I can say. So they can better make up their idea about what they're experiencing. But this first aspect of the service goes with the first aspect goes with the second most of the time, which is to advise the user of the service or the visitor, because normally people want to carry their solution by themselves. They want to solve the problems that they're facing by themselves, but they sometimes don't know really how to do it. So the ombuds can provide professional advices and also impartial ones on how to better deal with the situation they're facing. It can be seen also like as a coaching as well. And yeah, so those two part of the services goes usually together. But also by the fact that someone can reach out to the ombuds very quickly, like at the beginning of the tensions or the difficulty that they're facing, they can have access to the third aspect of the service, which is mediation or informal mechanism, which is a way, to solve to prevent the escalation of the tension that they're experiencing. So we can do mediation, and also an ombuds can start a process of a conversation or dialogue with a person in responsibility or authority. So it can already start a conversation, so the person or the visitor doesn't have to do it. So like the person, when the conversation is starting, the dialogue already started, and people are usually in a better place to receive the complaints or the comments or the difficulties that the person is receiving. And the fourth aspect of an ombuds work, it's to investigate. It's a more formal aspect of it, where usually in policies that governs different organizations, there's a capacity for the ombuds to investigate any situation, either to understand if the procedure have been followed, if there is behavior that were at fault, but also to understand if the result of a decision was fair, even though the procedure has been followed. So this is generally speaking the role of an ombuds. But the fact that I'm offering services to smaller organizations, I replicated the same aspect of ombuds, but I apply it in smaller organizations, just to make sure that, of course, the rules and procedures are followed, but also the way or the practices in terms of the relational practices, if I can say, they can foster trust and also fairness in how they're dealt with. So So I can advise both employees but also managers, which I feel that this is where the strength of the service can be, because it can help all levels of the organization towards achieving more fairness and coherence with their values and principles as well.
Okay, cool. So to kind of like to sum up that a little bit, those like 4 roles of listening, advising, mediation, and investigation, it's almost like those 4 roles kind of like going deeper into themselves. Like, listening is the first step, and then there's also advising as needed, going into mediation if necessary, and then, an investigation as well if it's required. And but being available for that is really the main point. I didn't know that it was a Swedish concept, or that the word came from that. I've been familiar with the concept of Ombuds services in large institutions in the past, but definitely working in theater, it's not necessarily as common in smaller organizations. And so I think it's really great that this is a service really tailored to that. I'm curious if you could tell us a bit about yourself in this role and how you came to this work.
Yes, of course. But as you said in the introduction, I'm trained as a lawyer, but I never wanted to become a lawyer. I was much more interested in the value of justice rather than like how to understand how the legal system was working. And the reason why I entered law school is because I want to work with the International Committee of the Red Cross, which I don't know if you know, but it's the organization that has the mandate to monitor the Geneva Conventions. So basically, we can frame it as being the ombudsperson for the victims of armed conflict. And I was very much interested in this because my first motivation in being interested in justice is that I have this fascination with understanding what it is like to respect and protect the human dignity. And I felt that going in situation where the violence were at this peak, it would help me first to work into the field that I was interested in and understand what I needed, but also contribute to this wider mandate, in which I really believe, also specifically because it was not politics. It was not politicized, at least. So I worked in Ivory Coast and South Sudan for 3 years altogether, working in a situation where there was a political unrest. And so when I arrived, I was full of my education of law. It was also my only reference to be able to solve those difficult situations. But I quickly realized that it was not the language that would be useful. First, because I was a woman, I was white, and I was in a context where I had nothing to do with. So my interlocutors were very reluctant to speak to me or to let me do the work that I was supposed to do. And I was working mostly in prison, so it was very sensitive work that I had to do. So I told myself, I didn't went through 5 years of painful 5 years of painful study in law school just to be defeated at the first 6 months of my work. So I had to develop an approach that would be respectful of everyone's reality. And very simply, I realized that having an approach based on dialogue, but also in acknowledging and respecting the perspective of all parties, and starting with their lived experience and realities, and start from there and building a dialogue without trying to control it or impose anything, but just try to mediate the conversation where we can, the parties will be able to find their own solution. I realized that the impact of it was extremely powerful, but also the result of those conversations was sustainable, and the satisfaction of all parties, which was bigger, much better than the thing that I could have achieved myself. So it really rang a bell in the sense that I start understanding better, what are the norms that you have to grasp to be able to build a dialogue, and also a solution that will be satisfactory and fair for all party involved, but at least to get as close as possible as fairness. So it was really a great learning for me, and I kind of developed this approach throughout the 15 years after, and this is where I specialize in conflict resolution. I made a degree in this field, but also I self-taught myself in ethics and mental health at work, just to be able to get knowledge and understand what are the norms that are playing when we are in interpersonal relationship, to be able to deal with those difficulties and have the concepts, but also the language to be able to understand like how we can maneuver with those very complex dynamics. So by doing this, like over the years, I realized that it has a very powerful but yet not very well known approach, which is totally different from what we learn in law school. So I felt that it would achieve the goal of justice, the value of justice I was seeking, and the impact was positive also in the different aspect of my practice. So this is why I decided to continue this work. And as you said, like for 6 years now, I'm doing this work that I'm passionate about, and I'm still learning every day.
Cool. Could you maybe expand a little bit on some other settings that you've engaged in conflict mediation, the variety of it? You've spoken about like working with the ICRC and working abroad in context of armed conflict, and I'm curious to know like that foundational aspect to your work. How has that maybe adjusted for different contexts, or is it something that you find remains relatively consistent despite what setting you might be working in?
Mm-hmm. I feel that so when some people like look at my CV, they don't understand like what's the coherence like amongst those things. But basically, like the line I follow throughout my career is that I've always been interested to be involved in a situation where there was a difference of power between the different parties, and to make sure that the intervention of a third party could help to give better chances to the less powerful party, just to make sure that they could have an equal voice. But also being interested in working in the relationships, like how the people, the dynamic between people, and sometimes people with institutions. I felt that like I realized that those situations was mostly where law was not. There was no law, or the law that was existing was not necessarily useful to solve the difficulties that we're facing. So all this knowledge about how to navigate through dialogue, and how to hold a dialogue that will be fair for all parties. I feel that I have a sense that it filled the gap that the law was not able, but also at the same time a knowledge that socially we don't necessarily master very, very well, in the sense that when we have dialogues, like we don't necessarily have dialogues, we mostly have debates, but also we were not necessarily cognizant about like the different aspect that we should grasp, like in order to have a fair approach. So I felt that this was a gap that I was filling. But more concretely, I've worked in situations where like in mediation programs where involve like the shop holders in the centers with the homeless population, just to make sure how they could cohabitate together. I worked also in restorative justice with victims of incest that wanted to go through a process of restorative justice with pedophiles. So like this one was that was a fascinating work, but also very intense and very sensitive, but so eye-opening at the same time. And it was really an experience where you can see that how giving a voice to people who don't necessarily have it can first give much better solutions to an issue, but also can raise awareness on the lived reality of the person that could be oppressed or face ongoing unfairness. And I also worked as a researcher at Commission Charbonneau in corruption and ethics. I was responsible for those two files, which helped me to grasp a much better idea of like what are the concepts and how to articulate them like in reality, and not without speaking like an academic language, but like more how we can really use those concepts like on our in our day-to-day life. And also worked as a restorative practitioner just lately with national defense. So that's basically briefly the different experience that I had. But as you can see, like it was always based on how we can build a dialogue or learn how to build a dialogue within parties that usually don't necessarily speak to each other, but also how we can give equal chances to both parties to make sure that they have both their voice in a particular situation.
Mm-hmm. Would it be fair to say that there's a lot of what your work involves is balancing the relationship between policy and then the interpersonal side that, and how that relates?
Yeah, totally. In fact, is to find a coherence between, and I will speak more specifically the work I'm doing, for example, with organization, with the theater organization or companies, is that, or smaller organization, is that people come to work in a place because they have a commitment to certain values, and they find that by entering an organization they can live by those values, or at least contribute to those values. But at the same time, the organization has this mission, but also it has these procedure and rules and obligations that everybody has. So the idea is try to build a language or dynamics or dialogues around how people can be themselves and come with their expectations and needs also, but tailor them in a way, or organize them in a way that can be coherent with the mission of the organization, while respecting also the legal obligations of the organization. So like it's a dialogue between different norms, and to make sure that we can find a way that like all parties can get to the best satisfaction possible, but always being coherent with why they're there and what's the mission of the organization. So it requires lots of creativity, because it's not a one size fit all. Sometimes you just change like very small things, like the person that is involved, the situation, that it can give a whole different solution or a direction to take. So yeah, so it's try to be able to find this coherence between the different needs and norms that we have to navigate with.
Right. Okay. And this segues us perfectly into our next question, because it's there's a wondering of how this fits into the needs of an arts organization or a theater company. And I think especially thinking about, for companies that have already robust policies in place, but maybe not this service yet, or for the companies who don't necessarily have much laid out in terms of policies, but still, they still carry that responsibility as employers to prevent harassment in the workplace, and the other responsibilities that come with employing anyone. How does this fit those? What have you been finding is the relationship between the needs of arts organizations and companies?
But I realized, since I'm working with companies, like my knowledge get like really bona fide over the last year. But also I had an experience for the last 6 years with the National Theater School. So I realized that it's an environment or a sector where people are very passionate about, like there's this will of being very relational, and they want to be able like to be as authentic as possible, which is all good. But at the same time, like when you have all like those expectations and needs in a world that is formatted or work and within like a legal framework, sometimes like when there's situations that are difficult, I realize that people are passing from like trying to solve difficult situation by themselves, like just as it goes. But when it was going to go a little bit strong, like the tensions were increasing, like the first reflex was to go with the legal aspects of things. So there was not necessarily a great like how to navigate this gray zone, or navigate like smoothly this passage from the legal, from the relational to the legal paradigm. So like having and I think that also in the art world, I think that we have to make sure that we keep the passion of people, or at least their passion won't go against them in this, like in the sense that we have to respect like their commitment to the organization. So I realized that in the art world, like it was good because we can focus more on the relational aspect. And I felt also that providing language and concept, and also ways to intervene in a way that you can stay in the relational aspect, I felt that people felt better tooled to be able like to deal with their daily situation, but also being more aware of like what to do like when the tensions are starting, just to make sure that they don't escalate. And yeah, so that's basically, and also the fact that like you're a small sector and people like go from a place to another. So it's not like when you work with big companies, when like the anonymity is a little bit bigger. So I felt that making sure that the relationships can be protected while solving the difficulties that the people were facing. I felt that it was important first to keep the passion of the people or the investment in the art sector, but also to make sure that it like the houses are in order, but in a way that doesn't hinder the relationship that people will have to keep, like whether or not they want it, because like if they navigate in the same environment, they will have to keep the at least a good way to communicate to each other, regardless of what happened between them.
Yeah, it does pose an interesting challenge, this kind of the fact that many of the people who are working in under these in this sector do really care about what they're doing, so it is often tied with that other kind of, with the real there's a personal aspect sometimes to it, even though it's a professional setting, and also because it is such a, as you said, it's a small sector, and it's also a very interconnected sector, so relationships exist beyond the organizations as well sometimes, so there's history and futures that come into it, which I think define how that relational side to it. And I'm curious to know, how would you, what would you define as the strengths that this service can offer organizations? How does it strengthen an organization to have access to somebody who is there to listen, advise, mediate, and investigate as needed?
Yeah, but I think that my first answer would be like better management of resources. I'm always uncomfortable to refer to people as resources, but if you have access to a service that can help you to prevent tensions and to create better relationships or foster trust, I feel that people will be better treated, or they can feel better treated, so therefore they're going to stay, they're going to engage better in the mission of the organization. So in this sense, you're going to be able your first material for creation is people. So at least if you protect people and you make sure that you offer them a safe environment, or at least a safer environment, I think that the organization gains from it. But another aspect is also that, like, when tension starts, like, it costs money and energy to everyone. So having the possibility to solve them quickly with professional advice or support, like, it decreases the chance of making mistakes, or because sometimes you don't have a second chance to fix a situation, and a situation that is not fixed properly is deemed to come back again, and sometimes like much stronger than before. So at least like you reduce your chances or the risk of making mistakes when solving a situation. I'm not saying that is always perfect, but at least by having a different, like another perspective coming from a professional, it can make intervention better as well. And the aspect that I want to like highlight as well is that if you use the advice part of the service often, it's a possibility also for managers or employees or whoever navigates or have access to the service as to build learning. Because I'm not going to hide that it's not necessarily difficult knowledge to get, but it's complex, and you have to understand how to navigate those things in a way, and how to integrate it in your organizational settings. So by using this service often and asking in prevention, like to verify or integrate the Ombuds service in different interventions that you want to do before or while you're doing this, like the organization gives itself the possibility to learn. And I think that those learning that is more tailored on a situation, because the participation of the Ombuds is integrated, I feel that it would be much more efficient that if you do, for example, a 3 hours training on how to solve difficult situations. So it's more a personal approach. So I think that those are the few strengths that I can identify. But also what's tricky with the Ombuds services, that since we try to work as much as possible in prevention, the return on the investment, sometimes it can be difficult to calculate because we cannot understand what you prevented really, and what could have been like the situation if you were not there. But so far what I had, the comments are quite positive about how they better the people who seek for those advice or the services, how better they could handle difficult situation that they wouldn't necessarily have handled it this way, but because we had conversation and received tips and advices, that they've been able to do it like in a different way that was maybe more constructive that their initial reflex. So
I think that's really interesting, that idea of, when working towards prevention, how sometimes it's hard to see, the results are, you got to track it in a different way. And I think that's a big point of it too, is the fact that the service, it's on the one hand, it's for prevention, so that it is, there is training involved, and there is an aspect of trying to reduce the impact of conflict in a workspace. And I think something that in my work in organizations that I've come to kind of understand is that conflict is unavoidable at a certain extent. It's going to happen, and the question for an organization is how, what are your mechanisms to handle conflict when it comes up? And I think it's on both ends. For the side of management and employers, there's that idea that when your main goal is to make sure that the operations are going smoothly, sometimes conflict, your main reaction to it will be to try and make it go away as fast as possible, which isn't necessarily the best way to actually deal with it in the long run. And for those, who might be trying to face something that is, unfair or unjust in the workspace, having that sort of support to be able to go to, to your employers, it can be really hard to address those things without that kind of outside perspective, that affirmation that what is happening, should be addressed, and advice on how it can be best addressed. It's kind of like prevention happens at the same time of actually dealing with it, because that's how the advice comes up.
Yeah.
And
if you might
varied.
Yeah, and they're very numerous, so it's difficult to just squeeze it in one like in a few minutes. But I just want to build on what you just said, because we tend to avoid conflict or to get rid of it as much as possible. But what we tend to forget is that there is a positive force to it, but you just need to be able to understand where is it and what to do with it. Because most of the time when you solve a situation through dialogue, usually there's a third idea. It's not only like the idea of a person A or person B. Like if we talk about it, like there can be a third solution that could be much better than if you had valued one or the other. So there's there's a great potential intention, but you have to be able to deal with it. It's a little bit like fire.
Yeah, and that's organizational growth ultimately, is that ability to kind of reflect on how things have been handled. Because when there's conflict, it's because something usually hasn't been handled as smoothly or as effectively as it could have. And so that's all, then that's how an organization learns and figures out how to handle these things better in the future. And so moving on to a next question, I know that it can often feel intimidating to integrate this type of service into an organizational structure. And I'm wondering if you have any tips for this. And I'll specify too, when that kind of sense of intimidation, especially for a company that might be very small, that might not even have many active regular employers, who might work mostly with contractors, or might be project to project as well. Sometimes it can be like, oh, it's such a big service, and how will it fit in? We already work really intimately. Like, often companies are very intimate settings to begin with, and so it feels like a big thing to bring an outside person in.
Yes.
So how would you recommend that one kind of curb that sort of intimidation, or how would you ask them to change their perspective on how a service can be implemented into their organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. But the first thing maybe I could say is that this kind of service can be intimidating for different reasons, because sometimes people can see it, like, as you said, like when welcoming like a third party from the outside of the organization. I realize that some people might be uncomfortable with having outsiders' eyes in their work, because as I said earlier, people are passionate about what they're doing and they do their best. So having someone like coming from outside, they're afraid that they're going to be criticized. They're going to be said that they're not doing the right thing and things like this. So I like to think that this service can become more comfortable if you have this will of improving your work, but with someone who's not going to criticize you, but just bonify your approach, and also maybe some tweak it just a little bit to start from your own reflexes and your own mentality, and just to make sure to bonify it in a way that like the chances to be fair and to reduce the risks of conflict are there. And also in terms of resources, I understand that the terms ombuds has something stern, so like it's something like big and heavy sometimes, but we can make it very light in a sense that if the role is clarified and people know what is the added value of on when and how to use this kind of service, and they integrate also this service in their way of thinking, and they try to grasp as much as possible from this added value. I feel that it's this is how you'll be able like to get the best out of it, because usually the ombud seems to be very official, but it works mostly like in informal conversations. So it can be integrated in different meetings, for example, like just to have like a different perspective, throw ideas, like questions that can generate also questions that an organization might not have asked itself at the very beginning. So it added perspective that the organization can play with and improve. Personally, the way I work is that I never impose my perspective, but I just throw ideas just to make sure that people can get ownership of it and take what they want. So like it's very a friendly approach, I would say. It's just to make sure that people remain open and the conversation are serving the purpose and what they want. And in terms of policy as well, like people often think that like we need all those policies to work with. But personally, I think that as long as you have the minimal policy that enables you to understand what are the values you want to protect or promote, and where are the marks of the things you accept and don't accept, like I think that an ombuds can work with it in the sense that like the what's acceptable and what's not acceptable is already outlined by the organization, and it gives guidance to an ombuds to be able to work with it. So it doesn't have to have all this like numerous and very heavy policies, because to be honest as well, like as an ombuds, I rarely intervene based on the policies, more on the gray zones that you get to intervene, because the policy cannot answer anything. So even with the minimal guidance in terms of policy, the ombuds service can be helpful, and it can be helpful also in a way that it will help you to fill the gaps more easily. You will have the language and the dynamic to be able to deal with the gray zones, which sometimes the policy never really grasps, because it's not the purpose of the policy. It's just to set lines. So yeah, I don't know if I answer your question fully, but this is what I had to offer.
No, I think that that's really helpful, and in some ways too. Again, that relationship between the policy and the interpersonal, I think it could exist on both sides. Where a company might feel like, oh well, we don't really have, we're not that big, and we don't have those kinds of policies in place because we haven't needed them. But really, what the policies are there, how they help the service is just to define what those values are and what the goals are of the organization. So even if it is just a list of like, this is what we're trying to do and this is what we don't accept, then that is already an indicator. And then on the flip side, sometimes there can be, from large organizations or from places where they do have all of a more robust set of policies, it can kind of feel like, well, we have everything set up, so we don't necessarily need that service anymore. But as you said, a lot of things fall through the cracks. Policies don't initiate the action or change. They're there to kind of guide it. So without, if you only have the guidance and then something doesn't really fit in what's been written out, then it's hard to really implement much.
And to be honest, I noticed that like the robust policy, like it's a good thing, because we live in a world where the legalities are important, but very rarely people will know what's like clearly or the detail, like will remember what are the details of those policies. And the opposite, like when your mission is clear, your values are clear, all those things are norms as well, that are to me as valuable as a legal norm or the policies that will be stated by your policies. So you just have to understand like what are the norms that are set by the organization formally or informally. Just the fact that you're in the art sector, it already brings out some values that you want to protect or promote, and just by the language that you want to offer, like it creates also norms that people expect you to respect. So even though it's not necessarily written, just how you carry yourself into the world and present yourself to the world is already a set of norms that comes out of it. But you have to understand like where they are, how you what expectation they created, and how you manage those expectations, because we tend to forget that the sense of fairness comes from how you're going to meet the expectation that you're creating. So in this sense, having an ombuds being able to deal with those messages that you might not be conscious that you're sending, but like still operate as norms, it can be very useful, because it's not a way that we usually deal with norms and see norms.
Yeah, it's almost like it's that sense of, review a little bit for the
Mhm.
organization.
Yeah.
So after kind of going through, I mean, I feel like we've just hit a lot of reasons, and we've talked about, the ways in which the service strengthens the organization, and the ways that could fit into organizations who might be at different places and different sizes, different contexts. But still, if somebody were to still be in a place after listening to all this and thinking, oh, I don't know if an ombudsperson is really useful for what I'm doing, if it's really useful for my company, my collective, or my operation, what would you tell that person?
But first, I would say that they're totally right to think that it's not good for them. I mean, like it's. I feel that this ombud service goes with a like a certain way of seeing your culture. Is not made for all organization, but I would tend to say that like there's benefit to all organization. But what you would be missing by not contemplating an ombuds, if I can phrase it this way, is that you can't like the outside perspective can bring oxygen to your own way of dealing with things or seeing things. So not benefiting for this, like it can create a limitation in how you're going to see this. Or it can also you might also do the same mistake over and over again without like with generally thinking that this is the way you should do it. But by having another perspective, like it can like sometimes bring another way of dealing with things, so it's going to improve your service. And also I feel that having an ombud service is it's also send a message to the employees that you're open to review your way of thinking, to improve, to give them a voice. So all those things are perks, if I could say, the service can offer. So if an organization thinks that they don't want them, it's okay, but at least they should make sure that they can provide like this outsider perspective and sense of fairness and dialogue within the organization, because this is really what the ombuds help to do for a small organization.
Hmm. Yeah, it really makes me think of this idea, and I think this is a big thing in this field, especially. Artists tend to have to be very self-sufficient and make things happen and do it all either on their own or with the limited resources and people that they have alongside them. So often, I think that can be, a very powerful approach of being like, well, I can do it. I can take it all on, but there are limitations to that sometimes, and having that outside resource who can really help take on
Hmm.
a perspective that might just be outside of what you're able to focus on when you're trying to do everything, running a company, putting on a production, those things that are important but maybe beside the goal of getting the project done.
Hmm.
Sometimes those can't be your main focus because what your main focus is making it happen. So having that other person there, that's when it really becomes invaluable.
Hmm.
Because you don't have time or the ability or the capacity to focus on it doesn't mean that it shouldn't receive that sort of attention.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And I think it's like, and thanks for bringing this point, because it makes me think that sometimes there's difficult conversation or decision to be taken. So when it falls on only one person who's already very busy and with lots of pressure, like sometimes your judgment might not be at this its best, or sometimes like you would like to get it solved as soon as possible without necessarily having the mental space or emotional space to get the finesse that it needs to deal with those situations. So at least for being able to consult someone else, like you can just have a soundboard, like just throw ideas, and after you can receive also advice on how to deal with those things in a way that will be sensitive and humane and respectful for the other person. So it takes away a burden, if I can say, or a weight on the person, because like the decision at least has been discussed with someone. So you don't have like it's not only it doesn't only fall on you to find the good solution. At the end, you're the one who's going to implement it, but at least you can have this comfort of having had this space to discuss it and to take like a much more informed decision that you might not have had the chance to do it if you're just thinking with yourself, and especially when you're a boss. Like, I mean, it's lonely at the top, so sometimes you don't necessarily have this person to be able to speak about those kind of conversations. So that will be also an added value. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine many of our viewers can relate to that feeling of really trying to make it all happen and really, approaching it with the many different perspectives as much as they can, but then still feeling that like, oh, if only I can just get a little bit off my plate or get that kind of support.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I think artists are often can feel that, the excitement of doing it all, but then also the pressures that come with that. And
Yeah.
so then it kind of this leads us to our final question of, what you would suggest to those who are struggling to pull the resources to engage this kind of service. If they want to be able to have an ombuds service in their organization or for their operation, but they're not necessarily finding the funding for it. Do you have any suggestions on that?
But it's difficult for me to offer like options, because I understand that like resources, it's a struggle. It's difficult, but I would say, but maybe use the momentum that we're now in, where people are or institutions are getting more and more aware of the importance of keeping a safe and healthy environment, also the added value of having a third party involved in the organization. So maybe looking for fundings or support from anyone who can help you to provide the resources. But also, the way I read your question is that I understand that is not necessarily is not all organization can have access to such resources, but at the end of the day, having an ombuds is to help to improve the culture of fairness and safety within an organization. So, of course, it will be much more work, but it's an information that can be like having the sensitivity. It's something that you can build within your organization. And if I can give you already a little tip about installing fairness in your organization, is try to give voice to people, to try to find balance between offering a voice to the people you're working with, but at the same time keeping in mind that you're the one who's going to take the decision at the end of it. But it's not because you're in space of authority that like you have to take unidirectional decision. You can receive also feedbacks from the grassroots or whoever you're working with, like just to bonify your own vision and way of seeing things, and just make sure that the decisions that you're going to take are in line with the message that you try to carry, you like the values you want to promote. And it's easy to say, oh, I'm in line, but just take the time to reflect, to think about it. Like the ombuds helps to make a slower decisional process, but it's not because it's slow that it's not effective. There's this power in waiting and in reflecting and consulting. And I think that if you don't have the resources to be able like to have this guidance, at least try make an effort to do it yourself, but sincerely and taking the time, which can be very counterintuitive in small organization where people are very busy. But that would be my offer for trying to install like a fairer environment in where you work.
Thank you for that offer. And I think to me, it really speaks to that, like that first important role of an ombuds service is listening. And sometimes I think employers might not necessarily have, it might feel difficult to really give the full focus of listening, but it just changes. It's just that relational aspect of making sure that, your approach to the people that you work with your team, that listening is still the first step, because it will inform a lot of what you can do.
Yeah, it's a very powerful tool. We often underestimate it. Like if we really we listen like very carefully and genuinely, it's sometimes it's surprising what you can get out of it.
Yeah, and leadership as being a way to kind of pool all of that, collective understanding that might exist on the team, all the perspectives to make decisions rather than, as you said, having to make a unilateral, like, I'm the boss and I know how to make a decision sort of approach
Yeah.
to it. And I want to add too, I think something, because it's relevant to QDF's endeavor in getting this service for our organization, along with the coalition. Stating the need to our funders has been a really great approach to making it possible. And I suggest that to anybody who's running an organization, who might be on a board, or who has any relationship to funders, that, when you are making your asks for your projects, for your funding operationally, that, you can really outline the need, the hours saved ultimately in production hours and work, because, as Caroline said, it does slow down the process when it comes to mediation, but that's to make the conflict, more holistically addressed, so that it doesn't tie up things further on, and so that, things can continue to the goal of the organization, and that those goals don't get derailed. So I think it's all of our responsibilities to name that need to our funders, and we're very fortunate to have been able to do that, with specifically with the Conseil des Arts de Montréal. They've been a great support in this endeavor. So as we wrap up, I want to first send my thanks out to them, to CAM, for supporting this project, as well to our funders, CALC and PCH. There's also the whole staff and board at the Quebec Drama Federation, who's making all of this programming and internal structuring possible. And of course, thank you to you, Caroline, for sitting down with me today and getting into this so we can talk about it with our membership.
Yeah.
And everyone at home, I just want to say, if you aren't yet a QDF member, please do sign up. It's a pay what you can membership. You can check out all about our services online. And we'd be lovely, we'd be super happy to serve you and to have you in our membership. Caroline, do you have any last words that you'd like to leave us off on?
Yeah, but first I want to thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to meet your community. So thank you very much. It was great talking to you, Gabe, and we'll see you around.
Cool. And we're gonna make sure that we link to Caroline's website, so you can also read more about her services, and the work at Omega Ombuds.
Yeah, and see, if you have questions, I'm always happy to answer them. So don't hesitate to call or write an email. I will be happy to answer your question if you have any.
Great. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks to you.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.